We boarded the Marco Polo and had a couple of hours to unpack and settle in before dinner was served.
Later, we were surprised to see that tugs were needed to move the ship to the lock,
where we had to wait a long time while a vessel carrying wind turbines sailed past. After 2 days at sea, we arrived at Copenhagen, where a short walk brought us to the Little Mermaid. And further on to Churchill Park and the attractive and lively city centre with its gigantic opera house.
Oh. A walk down busy Nijhaven took us past more exotic ships on the way back to the Marco Polo.
The following morning, we walked here to the impressive Castellet fortress, which was built after the Swedish siege on Copenhagen. It was also part of the defence of Copenhagen against England.
Nothing very exciting was happening today, though.
The swans and the family again.
We continued to the Amalienborg Palace, where the Danish royal family live,
before returning to the ship for lunch.
And another day and a half at sea. At Tallinn, a shuttle bus delivered us to the old town, where we wandered happily, remembering the streets and buildings seen on our visit last year. Too soon, it was time to return to the ship, where the resident classical musicians, Vladimir and Nadia, were being drowned out by the chattering.
In Saint Petersburg, our passports and tour tickets were approved by the unsmiling immigration officer, and we were allowed past the gate, where we met Elsa, who brought us here by the river Neva to start our tour.
The next stop was the Church of the Spilt Blood, which was built where Alexander II was killed. It was finished in 1907.
10 years later, the communists used it as a vegetable store.
In St. Isaac's Square, we admired the statue of Peter I on his prancing horse. Our tour guide had time tickets for us, so we were able to avoid the queues and walk straight into the Winter Palace and Hermitage Museum, where we were dazzled by all the gold.
A 6-ton urn marks the end of the Hermitage tour, and it was time for lunch, so Elsa took us to a pie restaurant. A trip on the Saint Petersburg metro was next on the itinerary.
And an incredibly long escalator took us down to this magnificent station with marble arches and mosaics.
Food might have been scarce in communist Russia, but the art was magnificent.
We took the train to the next equally grand station and then continued our tour with a visit to the Peter and Paul Fortress and Cathedral.
After a brief stop at this church, the bus took us next to the Yusupov Palace, where Rasputin was murdered.
To wonder at even more Tsarist extravagance.
Our journey back to the ship took us past these ugly apartment blocks where ordinary Russians live in complete contrast to the opulent palaces.
The second day of our tour saw us on a river cruise boat sailing past the Peter and Paul Castle. The rather boring guide on the boat pointed out other landmarks, including the Fabergé Museum,
the Russian Admiralty Building, and the battleship Aurora, famed for its part in the Revolution.
On the hydrofoil, the Chinese had bagged all the best seats.
So we sat at the back for the hour-long journey to Peterhof Palace,
where we saw that here the Tsarist extravagance had created the most fabulous water features imaginable. We could have spent a full day here, but time was limited, so we were whisked off for lunch, which included surprisingly tasty beetroot soup
and a glass of vodka.
After lunch, there was one last palace on the itinerary.
Built for Catherine, the wife of Peter the Great, this palace was left a burned-out ruin by the retreating Nazis in 1944,
but has now been largely returned to its former glory.
We had to wear covers on our shoes. It might have been so we could polish the floors as we walked round.
This is a copy of the original floor. It looks too good to walk on even with dusters on your feet. More gold adorns the fabulous rooms.
and a mirror, convenient for a reflection selfie.
A walk through the garden to the pavilion ended our 2 days in this city of gilded palaces.
On the next morning we were in Helsinki, where we collected a map and wandered.
After a coffee, we walked to the cathedral. The only bling in this church was the magnificent chandelier.
A walk by the river took us to the Botanic Garden, which was a disappointment.
Moss is not photogenic, and the greenhouse was closed.
Next we walked to the Parliament building behind this strange sculpture. That was also closed.
So we went for another coffee. The band playing as we walked back to the ship put a spring into our step.
Fortunately, the sea was calm, as tender boats were needed to get ashore at Nynäshamn. After a bus journey to Stockholm, we stopped at this viewpoint.
And then continued to the City Hall, while the guide told us all sorts of things that we have now forgotten. The Vasa Museum was well worth a visit. The ship is in amazing condition after 300 years underwater, and the models and displays show how it was brightly painted and why it sank.
The king insisted on seeing it sail before it had been fully tested for seaworthiness.
We left the museum in time to see the changing of the guard at Sweden's parliament.
And then returned to the ship on a tender boat. On the journey home, the Marco Polo was held up for a long time here in the Kiel Canal and missed the tide in Hull.
Second, for transiting from Brunsbüttel to Holtenau. The next day, a ceremony was held in Holtenau.
Near where that wall is.
Yeah, I thought so. I thought that's what sort of.
So we ended up in North Shields.